She was standing right there when he said it, not behind her back, not in a whisper, out loud, into the open air of a room full of people dressed in $30,000 worth of fabric, and not one of them flinched. "Get this woman away from the table. She's embarrassing to look at." The assistant manager, gold lapel pin, practiced smile, the kind of man who had spent his entire career learning exactly who mattered and who didn't, said it loud enough for 6 tables to hear, and then he laughed. And the people around him laughed too, the soft, private laugh of people who believe they are untouchable. Naomi Carter didn't move, didn't cry, didn't give him a single thing he could use against her, but something inside her shifted, quiet and permanent, like a bone resetting in the dark. If you think you know how this night ends, you don't. Because in less than 3 hours, every single person in that ballroom who laughed would stop laughing. And the man responsible would learn that cruelty, no matter how polished, always finds its way home. Before we go further, if stories like this one hit you somewhere real, somewhere deep, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories about dignity, betrayal, and the moments that change everything. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next in that ballroom? You're going to want to witness it yourself. The evening had started the way these evenings always started for Naomi, with a checklist and a deadline, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from the body, but from the mind that never stops running calculations. She had been hired 3 weeks earlier by the Grand Imperial Hotel's event division to manage the hospitality logistics for the annual Civic Gala, which was the kind of event that had a name nobody remembered but an attendance list that every journalist in the city would have paid to get their hands on. Politicians whose names appeared on buildings, celebrities who had stopped being recognizable as actual human beings years ago, investors whose decisions affected the daily lives of people who would never once know their names. Naomi ran the behind-the-scenes machinery that kept events like this from collapsing. She coordinated the caterers and the florists, and the AV team, and the valet service, and the dietary restrictions and the seating arrangements, and the last-minute changes to those seating arrangements, when 2 people who had apparently once shared a very bad history ended up placed 3 feet from each other. She was good at this work, exceptionally good. She had built her reputation across 11 years of events just like this one, and she had built it almost entirely invisible, which was, she had long since accepted, exactly the way clients like these preferred it. She was 36 years old. Her hair was natural and pulled back with a single clip because she had been on her feet since 5:30 that morning, and there had been no time for anything more elaborate. Her dress was professional, navy, well-fitted, appropriate. But it was not the kind of dress that belonged in this room, and she knew that, and she had not cared, because belonging in the room had never been part of her job description. Getting the room to function was. She had an earpiece in her left ear connected to her event coordinator on the floor below. She had a tablet with 17 open tabs. She had a backup checklist on paper in her left jacket pocket because she had learned long ago never to trust technology completely. She had eaten half a granola bar at 3 in the afternoon and hadn't thought about food since. That was Naomi Carter on a normal night. What she did not have, walking into the Grand Imperial Hotel's main ballroom at 6:47 that evening, was any reason to believe that this particular night would be anything other than exactly what it appeared to be: complicated, exhausting, and ultimately forgettable. She was wrong about that, but not yet. The ballroom was already filling when she entered through the side corridor that the event staff used specifically to avoid disrupting the flow of arriving guests. She came in from the left, near the bar station, and she stood for a moment taking in the room the way she always did at this point in an evening, not looking at the decorations or the centerpieces or the lighting she had already signed off on twice, but looking at the energy, the way people moved, where the clusters were forming, which sections of the room were already running hot with conversation, and which ones still had that thin, formal chill that meant guests hadn't yet found their footing. She was marking mental notes. Table 7 needed its 3rd chair replaced, the one with the wobble she'd flagged on Tuesday, when she first heard it, not directed at her. Not yet. It was coming from a knot of guests near the far end of the bar, 4 or 5 people, the kind of group that had been drinking just long enough to let the social performance slip a little. A woman in a red dress said something to the man beside her, and the man laughed, and the woman's eyes moved across the room and landed for half a second on Naomi and then moved away. And the woman said something else that made the group laugh again. Naomi had been in enough rooms to understand what she had just seen without having heard a single word of it. She noted it, filed it, kept moving. That was the first thing people who observed Naomi from the outside consistently failed to understand about her. They saw a woman who didn't react and concluded she hadn't noticed. What they were actually watching was a woman who had noticed everything and had simply made a different decision about what to do with what she'd noticed. There was a gap between those two things, and it was enormous, and almost nobody ever bothered to look for it. She crossed to table 7, crouched beside it, and radioed her setup team to swap the chair before the first seating wave hit. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and moved on. The next 20 minutes were purely operational. A florist had placed the wrong centerpieces on 3 of the VIP tables. The orchid arrangements that were supposed to be on 12, 14, and 16 had somehow ended up on 9, 11, and 13. And Naomi spent 14 of those 20 minutes calmly and methodically correcting this, while also fielding a near meltdown from the head of catering, whose sous chef had apparently just informed him that 42 of the confirmed guests had a nut allergy that had not previously appeared on any of the dietary documentation Naomi had provided. She pulled her paper checklist out of her pocket, found the dietary section, found the column she needed, and walked the catering head through the actual data line by line, while simultaneously directing the florist team with her free hand. She solved both problems. Neither guest ever knew either problem had existed. That was her gift. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't photograph well, nobody was going to write a feature article about it. But it was real, and it was rare, and she had spent more than a decade quietly building it into something she could sustain a life on. By 7:15, the ballroom was at roughly 80% capacity, and the ambient noise had risen to that specific level that meant an event was going well. Not too quiet, not frantic. The kind of hum that indicated people were actually talking to each other rather than just performing the act of talking to each other. Naomi allowed herself one moment of quiet satisfaction about this, standing near the south entrance and doing a final visual sweep of the room. It was during that sweep that she saw the assistant manager for the first time. His name was Preston Hale. She would learn that later. In that moment, he was simply a man in his mid-40s, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent a long time being important in a narrow world and had allowed that importance to expand in his own mind until it filled considerably more space than it actually occupied. He was moving through the room with a group of hotel executives and what appeared to be several high-end guests, and there was something in the way he moved, the way he angled himself toward the most prominently placed people and angled himself away from everyone else, that Naomi clocked immediately and filed under the category of people to avoid tonight. She had met Preston Hales before. Not him specifically, his type. Men who had learned to perform respect so convincingly that they had apparently forgotten they were performing it until someone beneath their threshold appeared in their field of vision and the performance dropped like a curtain. She went back to her tablet. The next hour passed without incident, at least not the kind that involved Naomi directly. There was a small situation near the East Corridor when 2 members of what appeared to be competing security details got into a staring contest that threatened to become something more physical, and Naomi quietly rerouted 2 servers to walk between them with trays of drinks until the tension dissolved, which it did. There was a moment of panic from the event photographer, who had lost her second camera bag and was convinced it had been stolen, and Naomi spent 3 minutes retracing the woman's steps and found the bag under a chair near the press area where the photographer herself had left it. There was a guest who had consumed enough of the open bar to require a quiet, dignified escort to one of the hotel's private sitting rooms, which Naomi coordinated through the hotel's front desk staff without anyone nearby noticing it had happened. She did all of this in the same continuous, unhurried motion, moving from problem to problem the way water moves around stones. Not stopping, not forcing, finding the path. At 8:23, she was standing near the dessert station reviewing the timing for the evening's program schedule when Preston Hale walked up behind her. She heard him before she turned, heard the group of people with him, the low current of conversation, the particular acoustic signature of a cluster of people who considered themselves to be the most important thing in whatever room they occupied. She turned. He was looking at her the way certain men look at things they have decided are not supposed to be where they are. Not quite anger, not quite confusion, but something adjacent to both that had contempt underneath it, like a foundation. "Can I help you?" Naomi asked. Her voice was professional, even. She had long since learned to lead with the question because it forced the other person to state their position explicitly, and people whose position was indefensible often became uncomfortable the moment they were required to say it out loud. Preston Hale did not become uncomfortable. That was the thing about him. Some people, when confronted with the opportunity to be decent, will take it even if it costs them something. Preston Hale was not one of those people. He had spent too long in rooms where nobody pushed back, and that had done something to him. Softened the part of him that might once have hesitated. "You're in the catering section," he said. "You should be on the other side of the rope." Naomi held his gaze for one beat. "I'm the event consultant. Naomi Carter. I'm managing tonight's logistics." Something moved across his face. Not embarrassment. Closer to recalculation. The brief visible process of adjusting his approach without changing his direction. "We've had some complaints," he said, "from guests about the setup." "What kind of complaints?" "Visibility concerns. About certain staff members." There was a half-second of silence that felt much longer than it was. "I'm not sure what that means," Naomi said, though she was already absolutely certain what it meant. "It means," Preston Hale said, and he dropped his voice slightly, not out of discretion, but out of the particular kind of weaponized quietness that is designed to make the target feel like they cannot respond at full volume without making a scene, that the guests of this event have a certain expectation about the aesthetic, and some members of your team are not quite, he paused, choosing, fitting. Naomi was quiet for exactly long enough to make him feel the weight of what he had just said. "Are you telling me," she said, her voice still even, still professional, her face giving him absolutely nothing, "that a guest has complained about how I look?" I'm telling you that presentation matters at events like this." "I agree completely," she said, "which is why I spent 70 hours this week making sure every detail of tonight's presentation was correct. Is there a specific logistical concern I can help you address?" His jaw tightened. She watched it happen and did not react. For a moment, she actually thought he was going to walk away, that the conversation was going to end there, unpleasant, bruising, but contained. And then the woman in the red dress from the bar appeared at his elbow, and behind her 2 men in evening wear Naomi didn't recognize, and the moment shifted. "Preston," the woman said brightly, and then her eyes landed on Naomi, and the brightness didn't exactly disappear, but it changed quality, became something thinner and sharper. "Oh, is this—" "It's fine," Preston said. "I was just explaining to this—" And he paused, and in that pause Naomi felt the whole evening tilt on its axis. "Woman, that the event staff should probably stay in their designated areas." And then he said it, not quietly this time, not with the weaponized whisper, out loud, at a volume that carried, with the particular confidence of a man who has never once been held accountable for what comes out of his mouth. "Get this woman away from the table. She's embarrassing to look at." The group around him laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, exactly. It was worse than a cruel laugh. It was a casual laugh. The laugh of people for whom this was entertainment, not transgression. The laugh of people who had been in enough rooms like this one to know instinctively that there were people inside them who could be laughed at without consequence. Naomi did not move. She had learned this a long time ago, that the first thing cruelty wants from you is a reaction, because a reaction makes you the story. It transforms the aggressor into a bystander and the target into a disruption. She had learned it young, and she had learned it hard, and she had paid for that lesson in ways she did not think about at charity galas if she could help it. So she stood exactly where she was. She kept her face neutral. She breathed. And inside her chest, in the place where she kept the things she didn't let anyone see, something went very, very cold. The laughter rippled outward. She could feel it moving through the room the way sound moves through water, changing shape as it went, picking up commentary, picking up momentum. She heard fragments of it without turning to look. Too fat. Who invited her? She looks like she wandered in from the kitchen. Each one landed. She didn't let them show. She had a gift for not letting things show that she had paid for with years of practice, and that she sometimes, in honest moments, resented owning because no one should have to get that good at hiding pain. She looked at Preston Hale for one more second. She looked at him very directly, very clearly, the way she looked at problems she intended to solve. Then she turned and walked toward the east corridor. She had 17 items left on her event checklist. The program was scheduled to begin in 42 minutes. The seating transition needed to happen in the next 20 minutes, or the timing for the evening's keynote would be thrown off by a chain reaction that would take another hour to unravel. She had a job to do. So she went and did it. What she could not have known, what no one in that ballroom could have known, was that at that precise moment, on the street outside the Grand Imperial Hotel, 3 black SUVs were pulling up to the curb. And the man stepping out of the first one had heard Naomi Carter's name for the first time 15 years ago, in a community center on the south side of the city, on a night when he had nothing, not food, not shelter, not a single reason to believe that the next day would be different from the one before it. He had spent 15 years waiting for a reason to say thank you. He had not expected it to look like this. But then, he had long since learned that life rarely shows you the door you're supposed to walk through until you're already standing in front of it. His name was Lorenzo De Luca, and he had just arrived. The SUVs didn't announce themselves. That was the first thing people who later tried to describe the moment always got wrong. They said there was something dramatic about the arrival, something cinematic, like the vehicles had materialized out of nowhere with theatrical timing. But that wasn't it. The 3 black SUVs simply pulled to the curb the way expensive vehicles pull to curbs outside expensive hotels, smoothly and without ceremony. And the valets who moved toward them stopped moving when the doors opened. And that stopping, that small, involuntary halt, was the first signal that something had changed about the evening. Lorenzo De Luca stepped out onto the sidewalk and buttoned the middle button of his jacket with the particular unhurried precision of a man who has never once in his adult life been in a situation he couldn't control. He was 51 years old, though most people who encountered him for the first time guessed younger. Not because he looked young, but because he carried himself with a kind of compressed energy that didn't map onto any particular age. His hair had gone silver at the temples in his early 40s, and he had left it there. His face was angular, weathered in the specific way of men who had spent significant portions of their lives under genuine pressure. Not the performed pressure of boardrooms, but the actual kind, the kind that leaves marks that no amount of money can fully erase. He stood on the sidewalk for perhaps 4 seconds, long enough to look at the hotel entrance, long enough for the 2 men who had stepped out of the vehicle behind him to fall into position without being directed to, long enough for the 3 valets who had initially moved toward the vehicles to exchange a look that communicated, rapidly and without words, a decision to find somewhere else to be. Then Lorenzo walked inside. He did not look like the most feared man in the country's organized crime landscape. That was the thing nobody ever understood until they were standing in the same room with him. They expected something theatrical, the ice-cold stare, the practiced menace, the deliberate intimidation. What they got instead was a man who appeared to be paying very close attention to everything around him while appearing to pay attention to nothing at all. It was a quality that took decades to develop and could not be faked. And every person in the Grand Imperial Hotel's main lobby who happened to glance up when Lorenzo De Luca entered felt something shift in their chest without being able to name what it was. His security chief, a broad-shouldered man named Carver, whose actual first name nobody used, walked 2 steps behind and 1 step to the left. Carver had been with Lorenzo for 9 years. He communicated in increments, a slight adjustment of his position, a fractional change in the angle of his head. And Lorenzo read these increments the way other men read text messages. Right now, Carver's angle said, "The room is aware of us." Lorenzo already knew. He moved through the lobby toward the ballroom entrance, and the small clusters of hotel staff who were stationed along the corridor did what hotel staff always do when they encounter someone they instinctively recognize as occupying a category far above their authority to address. They became very focused on whatever task was nearest to hand, and they did not make eye contact, and they did not speak. The ballroom doors were open. Lorenzo stepped through them. What happened next lasted approximately 6 seconds and fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the room in a way that no one who was present ever managed to adequately explain to someone who wasn't. The sound didn't stop all at once. It stopped in waves, spreading outward from the entrance, the way the first cold air from an open window moves through a warm room. The conversations nearest the door first, then the next ring out, then the next, until the whole ballroom had gone from the kind of elevated noise that indicates a successful social event to a silence that had texture and weight to it. People turned, not because anyone told them to, Because the same animal instinct that makes a room full of people glance toward a door when someone important enters, some prehistoric awareness of hierarchy and threat, turned them. And then they saw him. And the silence became something else entirely. Preston Hale, who had been standing near table 11 with a glass of champagne and the expression of a man enjoying a very good evening, felt the silence hit him before he understood what had caused it. He turned with everyone else. He saw Lorenzo De Luca standing at the entrance to the ballroom. And something happened to Preston Hale's face, a kind of reorganization, rapid and involuntary, as the social calculus he had been running all evening recalculated itself at a speed his expression couldn't quite keep up with. He knew the name. Everyone in this room knew the name. You didn't attend events at this level of the city's social architecture without knowing the name Lorenzo De Luca, the way you knew the names of weather systems, not necessarily because you had experienced one directly, but because enough people around you had that the knowledge had become ambient, unavoidable, part of the atmosphere you breathed. Preston's champagne glass didn't move. He was holding it too tightly for that. Across the room, the woman in the red dress, whose name was Claudette Marsh, the founder of a mid-sized investment consulting firm, married twice, the second time badly, had stopped mid-sentence in a conversation she had been conducting with something close to genuine enthusiasm. The sentence just stopped. The word that had been forming died in her throat. She stared. Lorenzo was not looking at either of them. He was not, in fact, looking at anyone in particular. His eyes moved across the room with the calm, systematic quality of a man taking inventory. Not aggressive, not threatening, simply comprehensive. The way a person looks at a room when they are genuinely interested in understanding what the room contains. And then his eyes found something and stopped. I was looking at the East Corridor. More specifically, he was looking at the entrance to the East Corridor, and the figure just becoming visible as she emerged from it. A woman in a navy dress, tablet in hand, earpiece in, moving with the particular purposeful efficiency of someone who has approximately 37 things to manage and has organized them in a precise sequence in her head and is executing that sequence. Naomi hadn't seen him yet. She was looking at her tablet. She was talking quietly into her earpiece. Something about the seating transition, something about the timing for the first course, and she was walking toward the central area of the ballroom because table 4 needed its place cards adjusted before the first seating wave, and she had precisely enough time to do it if she didn't stop moving. She stopped moving, not because she saw Lorenzo, because she felt the silence. And Naomi Carter, who had spent 11 years managing events in rooms full of people, understood what ballroom silence felt like in her body before she processed it in her mind. It felt like pressure, like the air had developed a different density. She looked up from her tablet. She saw the room, the turned heads, the frozen glasses, the expressions that ranged from controlled recognition to barely contained alarm. She did not yet see what they were looking at. She moved her eyes toward the entrance. She saw Lorenzo De Luca. She didn't know his name. She had no reason to know his name. In her world, the world of event logistics and hospitality consulting and 70-hour work weeks and granola bars eaten in car parks, the specific identity of the man standing at the ballroom entrance meant nothing. What she registered was what everyone else had registered, that this was someone who had just changed the gravitational pull of the room. And beneath that, something that didn't quite fit any of her professional categories, that this man was not looking at the powerful people in the room. He was looking at her. She held his gaze for half a second, confused, and then looked away and back at her tablet because she had 36 things to manage, and the seating transition wasn't going to run itself. Across the room, Preston Hale had set his champagne glass down on the nearest surface. Not a table, just a surface, the edge of a floral arrangement stand, and was straightening his jacket with the kind of unnecessary, self-conscious gesture people make when they're trying to look like they weren't just doing the thing they were just doing. His assistant, a young man named Derek, who was 2 years out of hotel management school and still operating under the impression that proximity to Preston Hale's authority was something to be cultivated, appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Hale," Derek said quietly, "should I—" "Not now," Preston said. "But the guest at—" "Derek." The word came out flat and final. Derek stopped talking. Lorenzo had begun moving through the room. This was the second thing people consistently got wrong in their later descriptions. They said he moved through the crowd, but that implied navigating, and Lorenzo De Luca did not navigate. He moved, and the crowd adjusted itself around him the way water adjusts around a stone dropped into it. Not because anyone was directing them to, because something in the room's collective nervous system understood, without articulation, that this was how it was going to work. Executives who had been absorbed in conversation glanced up as he passed and found something urgently interesting to look at on the other side of the room. A senator whose name appeared regularly on the front page of the city's major newspapers became suddenly absorbed in his phone. Two men who represented, between them, a significant percentage of the city's commercial real estate holdings found reasons to step back from their current positions. Lorenzo didn't look at any of them. He was still looking across the room in the direction of the east corridor. He was walking toward table 4. Naomi was at table 4. She didn't notice him approaching because she had her back to the entrance and her full attention on the place card she was adjusting, and because after 11 years of doing this work, she had developed the ability to filter out ambient room noise and social energy and focus almost entirely on the task immediately in front of her. It was a useful skill. It had occasionally caused problems. This was one of those occasions. She heard the footsteps when he was about 6 feet away, the particular quality of footsteps that belong to a man who takes his time, and she registered them as background information and kept adjusting place cards. He stopped behind her, slightly to the left. He did not speak immediately. The silence stretched for perhaps 3 seconds. And then Naomi, who had grown up with 2 older brothers and had long ago lost any patience with being loomed over without a stated purpose, straightened up from the table and turned around. They were closer than she'd expected. She took one small, involuntary step back before she caught herself and stopped. Up close, he was different than he'd looked from across the room. Not smaller. He was easily 6 feet, probably more, but more specific, more particular. The silver at his temples, the way his eyes, which were a dark, unremarkable brown, were doing that thing she'd noticed from across the room, taking in everything while appearing to settle on nothing. There was something about his face that was familiar in the way that a piece of music is familiar when you can't name where you heard it. "Can I help you?" she said. The same words she'd said to Preston Hale, the same professional reflex. But they landed differently this time, not because she softened them, but because the situation around them was entirely different, and part of her knew it even though she couldn't yet have said why. "You're managing this event," Lorenzo said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Since when?" 3 weeks. He nodded once, slowly, as though this answered something he'd been wondering. His eyes moved briefly to the tablet in her hand, then back to her face. "You're good at it," he said. It was a simple statement, no particular warmth in it, no performance, just an observation delivered with the same flat precision as a fact. Naomi, who was not easily thrown, was briefly thrown. "Thank you," she said, because it was the only appropriate response, and she was a professional, and then, because she was also a person who trusted her instincts, and her instincts were currently registering something she couldn't yet categorize. "Do I know you?" Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of something that had been a smile a long time ago and had left a trace. "No," he said. "You don't." And then, before she could respond, before she could ask the next logical question, before she could do anything at all with the peculiar weight of this conversation, Lorenzo De Luca looked past her at table 4, at the place card she'd been adjusting, and said, in the same even voice, "Who touched your dress?" She blinked. "What?" He was looking at her shoulder. She turned her head and saw it, the champagne stain that had appeared sometime in the last hour, the ghost of it, pale against the navy fabric, the kind of stain that happens in a crowded room when someone's drink gets jostled and they don't stop to apologize. She hadn't noticed it. She'd been moving too fast, managing too many things at once. "It happened near the bar station," she said automatically. "It's fine." "It's not fine." The firmness of it surprised her. Not aggressive, not anything like the way Preston Hale had spoken to her, which had been aggressive underneath its surface the way certain kinds of ice are aggressive, giving you nothing to push back against until you're already through it. This was different. This was simply certain. "I have a job to finish," Naomi said. "I know." He reached into his jacket. For a half-second, in the particular ambient tension of the room, Naomi's body registered something alarm-adjacent before she understood what he was actually doing. He was removing his jacket, the whole jacket, folding it once with practiced efficiency and holding it out to her. You don't have to, she started. The stain is visible, he said. Take the jacket. She looked at him for a moment. The jacket was Italian. She could see that without knowing anything about men's fashion, the same way you can see that a piece of furniture is expensive without being an antique dealer. It was worth more than most of the checks she'd cashed in the last 2 months. That's a very expensive jacket, she said. I know what it costs, he said. She took it. She didn't know exactly why. She told herself later that it was purely practical. The stain was visible, and she had 2 hours of work left, and there was no time to run to her car for the backup blazer she kept there, and the jacket was being offered, and it fit, more or less, because she was a tall woman. But the truth was more complicated than that, and she knew it even in the moment. There was something in the way he'd offered it that had bypassed her professional reflex and landed somewhere older. She put it on. He watched her do it without expression. And then the room, which had been managing the delicate act of pretending not to watch this entire exchange, stopped pretending. Preston Hale was the first person to speak. He didn't speak to Lorenzo directly. He spoke to Derek, who was still standing at his elbow, at a volume that was technically private, but that carried in the particular acoustic quality of a room that had gone very quiet. What is he doing talking to the help? Carver, who was standing 8 feet away, turned his head. Just his head. The rest of him didn't move. Preston didn't notice. Derek noticed. Derek took a very small, very careful step to the side, which accomplished nothing practically but satisfied some deep instinct in him to not be in Preston Hale's immediate physical vicinity in the next several minutes. Lorenzo had heard what Preston said. Naomi knew he'd heard it because she saw the slight pause, not in his face, not in his expression, but in the space between 1 second and the next. A pause that had no external form, but that she felt like a change in temperature. He turned toward Preston Hale. He didn't cross the distance between them. He simply turned in Preston's direction, and in doing so made the distance feel meaningless. What did you say? Lorenzo asked. The room's silence, which had been thinning slightly at the edges while people pretended to resume conversations, went solid again. Preston Hale was not a stupid man. He was something that was in many ways more dangerous than stupid. He was a man who was used to being right, used to being the one who defined the boundaries of acceptable behavior in his particular rooms. And that long habit had built something in him that was very difficult to dislodge even when the situation demanded it. He held his ground. That was his first mistake. I was speaking to my colleague, Preston said. His voice was careful. He was recalibrating, clearly, running a rapid calculation about who this man was and what the correct level of deference was. The result of that calculation was visible in the careful quality of his words. He had figured out enough to know that aggressive wasn't right, but he hadn't figured out enough to know that any version of not immediately retreating was wrong. I heard what you said. Lorenzo's voice was still even, still low. He didn't need volume for this. Ask me what I think happens next if you say something like that again. The room breathed. Preston opened his mouth, then closed it. The woman in the red dress, Claudette Marsh, had moved 3 steps backward without appearing to notice she'd done it. Mr. DeLuca, said a voice from the left. The hotel's general manager, a man named Frederick Goss, who had appeared from somewhere in the back of the room and was now approaching with the specific expression of someone who is walking toward a fire, because it is his fire and he cannot let it burn unmanaged, but who is also very aware that he himself might catch. Welcome. It's an honor to have you with us this evening. Can I get you anything? I want to know, Lorenzo said, and he did not look at Frederick Goss when he said it. He was still looking at Preston Hale, who gave this woman a hard time tonight. Frederick Goss stopped walking. I'm sorry, Frederick said. Now Lorenzo looked at him. The event consultant, Naomi Carter. She's been managing your gala for 3 weeks. Tonight someone decided she didn't look the right way for the room. I want to know who decided that. Frederick's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, comprehension, and then something that was not quite fear but was fear's professionally managed cousin. Frederick started. It wasn't a complicated question, Lorenzo said. Naomi had not moved. She was standing 6 feet from Lorenzo with his jacket across her shoulders and her tablet still in her hand, and she was looking at the scene with the same expression she used when a problem she hadn't anticipated appeared on her checklist: contained, processing, not yet certain what the correct response was. Lorenzo, she said. He turned to look at her. "You don't need to do this," she said. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "I'm asking a question. You're making a scene. I'm having a conversation. In the middle of a charity gala. People have conversations at charity galas." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has encountered an immovable object and is taking the measure of it. "I don't know you," she said, and there was something in her voice now that was not professional distance, was not event consultant neutrality, was something more direct and more tired and more honest. "I don't know who you are or why you care what happened to me tonight, but I've been getting through nights like this one for a long time, and I don't need—" "Carver," Lorenzo said. Carver, who had not moved from his position 8 feet away, shifted his attention. "How many cameras in this room?" Carver scanned the ballroom ceiling with the practiced efficiency of a man who has spent a long time thinking about sight lines. 14 interior, plus the private security cameras the hotel installed along the north and east walls. That's another 6. "Pull the footage from the last 2 hours. Naomi stared at him. "You can't," she started. "The hotel's security system is contracted through a company called Meridian Group," Lorenzo said, his voice still perfectly conversational. "Meridian Group's parent company is a holdings firm called Castellan Partners. I've had a seat on Castellan's board for 4 years. He looked at Frederick Goss. "Am I wrong about that?" Frederick Goss looked like a man who was reconsidering every decision he had ever made that had led him to this specific point in his career. "You're not wrong," he said, very quietly. "Then the cameras aren't a problem," Lorenzo said. Preston Hale's hand, which had been resting on the edge of the nearest table, tightened. The knuckles went pale. "I was doing the same calculation everyone else in the room was doing, trying to work out how much was visible, how far the footage went, what exactly those cameras had recorded in the last 2 hours. And unlike everyone else in the room, Preston Hale had very specific, very concrete reasons to be troubled by that question." "This is highly irregular," Preston said. His voice was steadier than it had a right to be, and Naomi recognized in it the particular kind of man who, when cornered, reaches for procedure and formality the way other men reach for weapons. "The hotel's security systems are not available for private—" "Carver," Lorenzo said, still looking at Preston. "Call Marcus." "Yes," Carver said. He was already on his phone. Naomi watched this happen. She watched Preston Hale's composure do the thing that composure does when the infrastructure supporting it begins to give. Not collapse all at once, but develop hairline fractures, tiny and spreading, visible only if you knew what you were looking at. She knew what she was looking at. "You need to stop," she said to Lorenzo, and this time there was something in her voice that cut through the professional surface. Exhaustion, raw and honest. The exhaustion of a woman who has spent her entire adult life cleaning up other people's messes and watching other people take credit and enduring other people's contempt and managing it all with grace, because grace was the only tool she'd ever been allowed to use. "Whatever point you're trying to make, I don't want to be the reason someone's evening gets destroyed. That's not who I am." Lorenzo was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with the same careful, comprehensive attention he'd been looking at her with since he walked into the room. "I know who you are," he said. She opened her mouth. "Better than you think," he said. And something in the way he said it, not aggressive, not presumptuous, just certain, the way he'd been certain about the jacket, the way he seemed to be certain about everything, in a way that wasn't arrogance, but was something older and quieter, made her stop, made her really look at him. She had the sudden disorienting feeling that she was standing at the edge of something she didn't have a map for. Before she could say anything else, Carver reappeared at Lorenzo's side and said 2 words. "Footage is live." Lorenzo turned to look at him. Carver held up the tablet he was carrying. On its screen, divided into 6 panels, was footage from the ballroom cameras. 2 hours of it, cued and ready. The timestamp in the corner of each panel read from 6:47 onward. The room, which had been teetering between the possibility of this resolving quietly and the possibility of something else entirely, made its decision. It was not going to resolve quietly. Preston Hale looked at the tablet in Carver's hand, and for the first time that evening, the performance dropped. Not partially, completely. What was underneath it was not the dangerous kind of ugly. It was the ordinary kind, the kind that lives in people who have spent too long believing their position made them untouchable, and now understood, in one specific and terrible moment, that it did not. Whatever is on that footage, Preston said, and his voice had lost its careful quality, had gone tight and a little ragged. This is a private event, and any recording made on hotel property. Lorenzo looked at him, just looked at him. Preston Hale stopped talking, and the footage began to play. The footage didn't lie. That was the thing about cameras. They had no interest in context, no capacity for the kind of social arithmetic that made human beings look at the same event and see completely different things depending on where they stood in the room and what they needed to believe. The cameras simply recorded light, motion, time. The specific angle of a man's body when he leaned toward a woman who had done nothing to him and said something that made the people around him laugh. Carver held the tablet at chest height so the screen was visible to anyone within a 10-foot radius. He did this without being asked. He had worked for Lorenzo long enough to understand the difference between being directed and understanding direction. The footage was time-stamped. 6 panels on the screen, each one a different camera angle, all running simultaneously. The ballroom in miniature, multiplied 6 times, 6 versions of the same evening, playing out in parallel. The first thing the footage showed was Naomi arriving through the side corridor at 6:47. She was on her tablet immediately, moving fast, head down, professional, not looking for anything except what she needed to manage. Nobody in the room watching this had expected to see how she'd spent the first hour. That was the thing that landed before anything else did. Not the cruelty, not yet, but the work. The sheer unrelenting quantity of work. The camera near the floral station showed her crouching beside a table to check a chair leg. The camera near the east corridor showed her talking into her earpiece while physically gesturing to a catering staff member, redirecting them mid-stride. The bar station camera showed her moving between 2 security personnel who were visibly tense, and then both of them being less tense 30 seconds later, and then Naomi being already gone, already moving to the next thing. 11 minutes of that footage played before Preston Hale appeared on screen. Lorenzo watched the screen. He didn't look at Preston. He didn't need to. Preston was watching the screen too, and what was happening to his face was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the slow, private dissolution of a man watching evidence of himself that he cannot explain away. The particular horror of being seen not as you present yourself, but as you actually are. The camera near table 11 had caught everything. The angle, the volume, the laugh. The group around Preston, Claudette Marsh with her head tilted slightly back, a gesture that reads as amusement in the body before the face even fully commits to it. The 2 men in evening wear. The assistant manager's particular expression, which on camera looked worse than it had probably felt to produce. The kind of expression that settles onto the faces of people who spend enough time performing contempt that contempt becomes the default setting. Get this woman away from the table. She's embarrassing to look at. No ambient noise covered it. The camera's audio pickup was clean. The room, which had been doing various versions of pretending not to look at the tablet, stopped pretending. Claudette Marsh made a sound. Not a word. Something small and reflexive that she couldn't have anticipated making and clearly wished she hadn't. The 2 men in evening wear found reasons to look at the floor. Preston Hale's jaw set so hard that the muscle along the side of it was visibly working. "That's enough," Preston said. His voice came out wrong, too tight. The professional control he'd been maintaining since Lorenzo arrived had developed a crack in it, and the crack was audible. "I disagree," Lorenzo said. "This is harassment." Preston turned to Frederick Goss, who was standing 5 feet away with the expression of a man who has understood that there is no good outcome available to him and is trying to identify the least bad one. "Frederick, I need you to intervene here. This man has no authority to access hotel security footage for personal—" "He's on the board," Frederick said quietly. "I don't care if he's on the board. There are protocols." "Preston." Frederick's voice dropped even further, to something barely above a murmur. "Stop talking." Preston looked at him. What passed between them in that look was not friendship. These were not men who had ever been friends, but something more pragmatic, the recognition between 2 people who exist in the same professional ecosystem that one of them has just made a miscalculation that is going to have consequences for the other. And the message being communicated was, "Do not make this worse for both of us." Preston closed his mouth. He looked back at the screen. The footage had continued while they were talking. What was playing now was the segment that Naomi had not seen, because her back had been turned and she had been moving away. The camera near the Champagne service station had caught the group around Preston in the aftermath of the initial comment. The ripple of it, the way it spread to the next cluster of guests, the way certain people leaned in and others turned away, and the way the ones who turned away didn't turn far enough to make it a statement, just far enough to give themselves the private option of later saying they hadn't participated. Naomi, watching the screen, was very still. She had known what had been said behind her back in the broad sense. She'd felt it, the way you feel weather moving in before you can see the clouds. But knowing in the general sense and seeing the specific footage were different experiences, and the footage was specific. Names she didn't know, faces she half recognized, gestures she hadn't been positioned to witness. The camera near the dessert station had caught something else. A server, a young woman, maybe 22, 23, in the hotel's standard uniform, standing near the edge of the group, holding a tray, her face turned slightly away from the cluster around Preston. Not away enough to make her disapproval legible to the people she was serving, but away in the way people turn when they can't agree with what's happening around them and also can't afford to say so. Naomi noticed this detail on the screen before anyone else did. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed it. Lorenzo noticed her noticing. He looked at the server footage for a moment, then back at Naomi's face, and something happened in his expression that was not sentimentality. Something more precise than that, more like recognition. "There's more," Carver said. This was the first time he'd spoken since telling Lorenzo the footage was live, and the word landed with the particular weight of words that have been held for exactly the right moment. "How much more?" Lorenzo said. Camera 9. The corridor by the north stairwell. Timestamp 7:41. The tablet shifted. The six-panel view collapsed into a single full-screen image. Camera 9. A corridor, quieter than the ballroom, the ambient noise of the event muffled by a set of closed interior doors. The timestamp in the corner, 7:41:18. The footage showed the corridor empty for approximately 6 seconds. Then a door opened and two people walked in. The first was Preston Hale. The second was a man nobody in the room immediately recognized. Dark suit, no event badge, the kind of face that was designed to not be memorable. They spoke for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. No audio. This was a camera positioned for security sightline coverage, not audio capture. The mic sensitivity was low, but the visual was clear enough. The unrecognized man handed Preston a phone. Preston looked at the screen. Preston's expression shifted. Not the managed shifting of a man in a public room, but the private, unguarded kind. The kind that happens when you believe you're alone and have stopped performing. What moved across his face was, in sequence, assessment, calculation, and then something that was satisfaction, but with something darker underneath it. The satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping to confirm. Preston handed the phone back. He said something. 3 words, maybe 4. The unrecognized man nodded. Then he left the corridor through the door he'd come in from, and Preston stood alone for a moment, straightening his jacket with the same unnecessary, self-conscious gesture he'd used earlier in the ballroom, and then he too left. The footage ended. The room's silence had changed quality again. It had gone from the silence of a social event that had been disrupted to something more fundamental, more airless. Naomi spoke first. "Who was the other man?" she said. It was not quite a question. Lorenzo looked at Carver. "Marcus is working on it," Carver said. "Marcus has been working on it for 11 minutes, Lorenzo said. "He'll have something in 4. "Make it 2. Carver stepped away, phone already to his ear. Naomi turned to look at Preston Hale. She looked at him the way she'd been trained to look at problems, fully, without flinching, without the impulse to soften what she was seeing. What she saw was a man who had spent the entire evening operating under the assumption that he was the most powerful person in the room and who had discovered, in the last 15 minutes, that he had been catastrophically wrong about that. And underneath the discovery, she could see something else, a quality in his stillness that was not the stillness of a man who had been caught being unkind and was now contrite. It was the stillness of a man who was still calculating. That stillness frightened her more than the footage had. "What was on that phone?" she said to him directly. Preston looked at her. For a moment she thought he was going to refuse to answer, going to reach back for the formal, procedural armor he'd been wearing earlier, going to say, "I don't know what you're talking about," or "This is not an appropriate venue," or some other variant of the retreat she'd watched men like him, make 100 times when the walls started closing in. He didn't. "You should have stayed in your lane," Preston said. His voice was different now. The carefulness was gone. What was underneath it was tired and hard and old in a way that didn't match the polished surface he'd been presenting all evening. "Excuse me?" Naomi said. "This event," Preston said, "was not a casual charity gala. It took 8 months to arrange, 8 months of negotiations and agreements and very delicate arrangements between people whose cooperation with each other does not come naturally." His eyes moved briefly to Lorenzo and then back to Naomi. "You were hired to manage logistics, centerpieces and seating charts. You were not supposed to be in the center of the room. You were not supposed to attract attention. You were certainly not supposed to end up in the middle of a conversation that involves—" He stopped. The room waited. "Involves what?" Lorenzo said. Preston looked at him. "You know what?" Preston said. Something shifted in Lorenzo's posture, small, and to someone who didn't know what to look for, invisible. But Naomi was standing close enough to see it, and what she saw was a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected and who was now deciding what to do with the confirmation. "Say it plainly," Lorenzo said. "There are people at this event tonight who don't want your attention," Preston said. "People who came here because they were told you wouldn't be. People who made arrangements, financial arrangements, contractual arrangements, that they'd prefer remained unexamined. And then you walked in, and then you walked directly to her." He looked at Naomi again. "And every camera in the building turned that direction. And every person in this room who was here for reasons they'd prefer not to explain started asking the same question." "What question?" Naomi said, though she was already beginning to understand, and the understanding was making her stomach tight. "Whether you're working for him," Preston said. The silence that followed was the longest one of the evening. Naomi heard it land, felt it move through her. Or this was the thing she hadn't seen coming. Not the insults, not the footage, not even Lorenzo's arrival. This, the way one man's attention could be weaponized against the person it was directed at. The way being chosen as the recipient of something could redefine you in the eyes of everyone watching, regardless of whether you'd asked for it, regardless of whether you'd consented, regardless of the truth. "I am a hospitality consultant," she said. Each word was separate and deliberate. "I have been employed by this hotel for 3 weeks. I have never met this man before tonight." "That's what you'd say either way," Preston said. "Preston." Frederick Goss's voice had completely lost its professional quality. He just sounded tired. "That's enough." "Is it?" Preston said, and there was something breaking open in him now, the calculation giving way to something rawer. "Because there are 12 people in this room tonight who are going to walk out of here and make 12 phone calls about what they just watched. And none of those calls are going to be about the charity dinner. They're going to be about why Lorenzo DeLuca showed up to an event he wasn't on the guest list for and made a beeline for the woman managing the hospitality, and what that means for the agreements that brought everyone else here tonight. And some of those agreements involve names that—" "Stop!" Lorenzo's voice was not loud. It was almost gentle. It was the gentleness of someone who has moved past the point where volume is useful. Preston stopped. "You've just told me everything I needed to know," Lorenzo said. "I wasn't sure why certain people were at this event tonight. Now I am." He looked at Carver, who had returned from his phone call. "Marcus." "The man in the corridor is a courier," Carver said. "Works for a firm called Harton Advisory. The firm is a registered lobbying entity. Its primary clients in the last 18 months have included 4 of the names on tonight's guest list." "Which 4? Carver said 4 names. Lorenzo absorbed them without visible reaction, but something happened around his eyes. A narrowing that was not anger, but was the thing that comes before decisions are made. "One of those names," Naomi said slowly, "is on the guest list for the foundation presentation tomorrow morning." She was looking at her tablet, at a document she'd been accessing to confirm the morning event's logistics. Her voice was level, but she was doing the math, and the math was not producing a comfortable answer. "The one that's being held in the hotel's East Conference Room, at 9 a.m. "I know," Lorenzo said. "That presentation involves a considerable amount of donated capital," Naomi said. "Capital that was supposed to be distributed to 3 youth housing programs by the end of the month." "I know," Lorenzo said again. She looked up from the tablet. "How long have you known?" He held her gaze. "Long enough." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." She understood in that moment that she was standing in the middle of something that had been in motion long before she arrived at the Grand Imperial Hotel tonight, long before she'd been hired 3 weeks ago. The event she'd been managing, the logistics she'd spent 70 hours on, the seating charts, the centerpieces, the dietary restrictions, the chair with the wobble at table 7, had been the surface of something else entirely. And the something else was very large and had been arranged very carefully, and she had been placed in the center of it without anyone telling her it existed. The anger came up fast, faster than she usually let things come. "You knew something was wrong with this event," she said to Lorenzo, and her voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her something now. "And you came here tonight, not because you happened to be in the area, not because someone mentioned there was a charity gala. No," he said, "you came here because of something specific." "Yes." "And I was already here." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "And it didn't occur to you to—" She stopped, started again. "If there was something wrong with this event, if the people in this room were here for reasons that could put the people I've been working with for 3 weeks in a difficult position," her voice cracked, very slightly, on the last 3 words, and she visibly resented the crack and pressed past it. "You could have said something. You could have called someone. You didn't have to walk in here and—" "I didn't know you were going to be here," Lorenzo said. The flatness of it stopped her. "When I found out this event was happening," he said, "and who was attending, and what was being arranged on the margins of it, I had a specific set of concerns that had nothing to do with tonight's hospitality team. And then I walked through that door and saw your name on the event coordinator's badge, and I—" He paused. For the first time that evening, he paused in a way that seemed involuntary. "I stopped." Naomi stared at him. "You know my name," she said. "Yes." "We've never met." "I know." "Then how'd, Naomi?" His voice was very quiet. "I know who you are. I told you that earlier. I meant it in a way that I'm going to need to explain properly, and this is not the right moment for that explanation, because there are 12 people in this room running 12 different calculations about what they're going to do next, and some of those calculations involve options that I need to address before they get put into motion." He looked at Carver. "Clear the room," he said. "Not guests. Staff with access to back corridors. I want every service exit covered, and I want Marcus to send me the Harton advisory file." Carver moved. What happened next happened in under 90 seconds, and it was not chaotic. It was the opposite of chaotic. It was precision applied at speed. But the effect on the room was as disorienting as chaos would have been. Lorenzo's people, who had been positioned around the ballroom's periphery in positions that now revealed themselves as strategically chosen rather than incidental, moved to the exits with the particular efficiency of people who have performed this kind of action before and know exactly what they are doing. Not aggressive, not threatening, simply present, in places that mattered, in ways that made the architecture of the room feel different than it had 60 seconds ago. 2 men near the north exit turned and found one of Lorenzo's security detail standing at the door they'd been moving toward. The men stopped. They looked at each other. They turned back. 3 tables away, a woman in a green dress who had been reaching for her phone with the particular purposeful angle that meant she was about to make a call that wasn't social, had something happen in the space between her hand and the phone. Not interception, not confrontation, simply the appearance, at her left elbow, of a presence that made her reassess the timing of the call. Her hand came back to the table. Preston Hale watched all of this happen, and what moved through his face was the thing Naomi had been watching for, the thing that told her more about the actual situation than anything that had been said in the last 20 minutes. Not fear, but the recognition of a man who has understood that the game he thought he was playing was not the game being played, and that the distance between those 2 games is where people disappear. "You can't keep these people here," Preston said to Lorenzo. "This is false imprisonment." "Nobody's being kept anywhere," Lorenzo said. "The exits are open." "Frederick?" He looked at Frederick Goss. "Are the exits open?" Frederick Goss, who at this point appeared to have made his peace with the fact that tonight was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet fully assess, said yes, in a voice that had been reduced to something barely operational. "There you go," Lorenzo said to Preston. "Nobody's keeping anyone." He crossed to a chair at the nearest table and pulled it out and sat down in it with the unhurried quality of a man at a business meeting and looked at Preston Hale. "Sit down," he said. Preston didn't sit. "The people you're protecting," Lorenzo said. "The arrangements you mentioned. The names Carver just gave me." He was quiet for a moment. "The money that was supposed to go to the housing programs." Something moved across Preston's face. "I don't know what you're talking about," Preston said, and it was the worst thing he could have said, not because it was a lie. Everyone in the room understood it was a lie, but because it was the kind of lie that announces itself. The kind that only gets said when the truth is bad enough that the liar has decided denial is worth attempting even when it can't possibly succeed. Lorenzo looked at him with an expression that was almost something like pity. "The foundation presentation tomorrow morning," Lorenzo said. "The East Conference Room, 9 a.m. He paused. "The capital that was supposed to go to the youth housing programs." Another pause. "Tell me where that money actually goes, Preston." The room was so quiet that when Claudette Marsh shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the sound of it was audible. Preston Hale stood in the center of that silence, and he looked at Lorenzo DeLuca, and he looked at Naomi Carter, and he looked at the tablet in Carver's hands with the footage still time-stamped and visible, and he understood, in the specific, terrible way that you understand things when you are standing in a room with no exits that aren't watched, and no version of the next 5 minutes that doesn't cost you something significant, that the calculation he'd been running all evening had been wrong from the beginning. He had thought this was a room he controlled. He had thought Naomi Carter was a detail. He had thought Lorenzo DeLuca's arrival was a complication he could manage. None of it had been any of those things. And now he was standing in the rubble of that misunderstanding with 12 people watching and a camera that had already recorded more than enough, and a woman he had publicly humiliated less than 2 hours ago who was looking at him with an expression that was not triumph. That was the thing that unsteadied him more than any of the rest of it. The fact that she wasn't looking at him with triumph. She was looking at him with something that he couldn't immediately name because it was not an expression he was accustomed to receiving. And whatever he said next was going to be the thing that defined the rest of this evening. He made his decision. He reached into his jacket pocket, and he pulled out his phone and began to dial. Naomi saw it happen and understood what it meant before Lorenzo did, because she had spent the evening watching the room, and she had cataloged, without consciously intending to, the specific movements and positions of the people in it, and she knew which direction Preston's phone was pointed, and she knew, with a certainty that landed in her chest like cold water, exactly who Naomi moved before she finished the thought. She crossed the 6 feet between herself and Preston Hale in 3 steps, and she put her hand flat on his chest, not pushing, just stopping, the way you stop a door from closing. And she said one word. "Don't." Preston looked down at her hand, then up at her face. His phone was still in his grip, the screen lit, the number half dialed. "Get your hand off me," he said. "Who are you calling?" "That is none of your—" "Who are you calling, Preston?" The use of his first name did something to him, not softened him, the opposite. It reminded him, apparently, that she was still just a hospitality consultant in a borrowed jacket, and that the fundamental order of things, whatever tonight had looked like, had not actually changed. He pushed her hand away. Not hard. Controlled. The kind of push that leaves no mark, and is therefore technically not a push at all, just a removal, a reclassification of where her hand was permitted to be. Naomi took a half step back. Her shoulder caught the edge of a chair, and she grabbed the chair back to steady herself, and did it without looking down, kept her eyes on Preston, kept her face from doing the thing it wanted to do. Lorenzo was out of his seat. He didn't run. He didn't need to. He simply stood up and covered the distance and was between them before the moment had finished happening, and when he got there, he looked at Preston Hale with an expression that had finally, for the first time all evening, dropped the conversational quality entirely. "Give me the phone," Lorenzo said. "You have no authority. Give me the phone. This is assault. This is— Nobody touched you." Lorenzo's voice was flat and final. "Give me the phone." Preston's hand tightened around the device. His knuckles had gone the color of old wax. He was breathing through his nose, short and deliberate, the way people breathe when they're trying to maintain control of something that is actively trying to escape them. And Naomi, standing 2 feet away with her hand still on the chair back, could hear it, could hear the effort in it, the way each breath was a small act of will. "There are people," Preston said, "who are going to hear about tonight. People who have been watching this room and are going to hear within the hour that Lorenzo De Luca appeared unannounced at an event they specifically arranged without his knowledge. And those people are going to ask questions, and the answers to those questions are going to create a situation that you—" He looked at Lorenzo directly, and there was something almost like courage in it, the specific courage of a man who has decided that since he's already past the point of safe retreat, the only available move is forward, are not going to be able to manage quietly. The room breathed. Lorenzo looked at him for a moment. "Marcus," he said. Carver handed his own phone to Lorenzo, screen first. On it was a document, several pages, text-dense and formatted like a legal brief, a series of account numbers and transaction records, and a name at the top that Naomi couldn't read from her angle. Lorenzo held it up so Preston could see the screen. Preston's breathing changed. The controlled, deliberate rhythm broke. For just a second, 1 second, the length of a heartbeat, his face went completely still in the way faces go still when the mind behind them has just absorbed something it wasn't prepared for. "Marcus has been thorough," Lorenzo said. "He usually is." "Where did you get that?" Preston said. His voice had lost its shape, just words coming out. That documentation is private. It's legally protected. It cannot be—" "It was sent to Marcus by someone who was concerned about tomorrow morning's presentation," Lorenzo said. "Someone who works inside the Harton Advisory Office and has been concerned for approximately 6 weeks and finally decided that concern required action." Preston stared at the screen. "That's the Capitol," Naomi said. She had moved around the chair and was looking at the document now, and her voice had gone very quiet. She was doing what she always did with problems, looking at them directly, making herself absorb what she was seeing rather than what she'd expected to see. "That's the money from the housing programs." She looked up at Lorenzo. "It's already been moved." "Yes," Lorenzo said. "When?" 2 days ago." She looked back at the screen, at the account numbers, at the name at the top, at the transaction timestamps and the amounts and the destination accounts, which were not the youth housing programs they were supposed to be, were not anything remotely connected to the charitable foundation whose name was on the morning's presentation materials, were instead a series of numbered accounts and jurisdictions that were chosen specifically because they made the process of asking questions about them very slow and very expensive. $3,400,000, she said. It was not a question. The number was on the screen. "Yes," Lorenzo said. She looked at Preston Hale. He was not looking at either of them. He was looking at a point somewhere between the floor and the middle distance, the specific, unfocused stare of a man whose internal calculation has just produced a number he didn't want. "Those programs," Naomi said, and her voice was doing something it hadn't done all evening. It was shaking, slightly, not with fear but with the specific tremor that comes from holding anger at very close range for an extended period. "The housing programs that money was supposed to fund. I know one of them. The Meridian Street Transitional Housing Project. I've done events for them. Fundraisers. I know the director. I know what that facility is. I know who lives there." Preston said nothing. 53 people, Naomi said. 53 people in transitional housing who were waiting on that capital disbursement to maintain their lease agreements through the end of the year. Because the foundation committed to it, because someone stood up at a podium and made a commitment, and people believed it and stopped looking for other options because they thought the money was coming. Preston's hand, the one holding the phone, had dropped to his side. "Was it your call?" Lorenzo said. "Or were you handed this?" Preston looked up. "Does it matter?" he said. "Yes," Lorenzo said. "It matters to how the next 30 minutes go." Preston's jaw worked. He looked at Claudette Marsh, who was standing near the edge of the group, and Naomi watched the look pass between them and understood, in the way you understand things you wish you didn't, that the arrangement between these two people was older and more complicated than tonight, was something that had been built over time in rooms she hadn't been in and conversations she hadn't overheard. Claudette looked away. Something crossed Preston's face, something old and tired that didn't belong on a man who'd spent the evening performing confidence. "Claudette brought in 2 of the investors," he said. "Preston." Claudette's voice was sharp. "Claudette brought in 2 of the investors who suggested the capital redirection," Preston said. and his voice had flattened into something that was past the point of emotion. Just information now. The voice of a man who has decided that if he's going under with his hands empty. The agreement was structured so that the foundation retained its charitable status on paper while the actual disbursement was rerouted through Harton before it reached the receiving accounts. The receiving accounts were supposed to hold the money for 60 days while 3 separate investment vehicles completed their cycle. At the end of 60 days, the full principal plus returns goes back to the programs. The programs get their money plus an additional 14%. The room was absolutely still. And the 60 days ends when, Lorenzo said. November 18th, Preston said. And the investment vehicles, Lorenzo said. Tell me about those. Something happened in Preston's face. The flatness developed a crack in it. The vehicles are legitimate. They're registered. He stopped. They're registered to Harton Advisory, Lorenzo said, which is registered to a holding company in the Cayman Islands, which has 3 directors, 2 of whom are names I know, and 1 of whom is a name that appears in a federal investigation that was sealed 8 months ago. The crack in Preston's face widened. You didn't know that part, Lorenzo said. It was not unkind. It was simply an observation, made with the precision of someone who has spent a long time assessing what people know versus what they think they know. I was told the structure was clean, Preston said. It's not clean, Lorenzo said. I was told, it's not clean, Preston. Something in Lorenzo's voice shifted, not harder, almost the opposite. You were used, and you used other people. And the people at the end of that chain are 53 individuals who did nothing except trust that a commitment made publicly by an organization with a charitable designation meant something. Preston's phone slipped from his hand. It hit the floor. The screen cracked, a single fracture line running from one corner to the center. Nobody moved to pick it up. Claudette Marsh made a sound that was not quite words. I want a lawyer, she said. You're at a charity gala, Lorenzo said. Nobody's arresting anybody. Then what is this, she said. Her voice had lost the bright social quality completely. What was underneath it was thin and frightened and older than her performance had suggested. What is this? What did you want? I want the money back in the correct accounts by 9 a.m. tomorrow, Lorenzo said, before the presentation begins. Full amount. No conditions. Claudette stared at him. That's not, she started. The capital is in instruments that take 48 to 72 hours to... I know how the instruments work, Lorenzo said. I also know that Harton Advisory maintains a liquidity reserve specifically for situations where an instrument needs to be exited ahead of schedule. The reserve covers the full amount. It will cost them the 14% return and a penalty fee. That's their problem, not mine and not the housing programs. The specificity of it silenced her. She had been operating under the same assumption Preston had been operating under. The assumption the whole arrangement had been built on, that the complexity of the financial structure provided cover, that it was too intricate, too layered, too deliberately obscured for anyone to move through it quickly enough to matter. She had been wrong. Claudette looked at her hands. She was wearing a very expensive ring on her left hand, and she was turning it on her finger with the repetitive, unconscious motion of someone whose body is doing something to keep itself occupied while the mind works through a problem it can't solve. And if we can't access the reserve by 9 a.m., she said, then what's on Carver's tablet goes to 3 different federal offices at 9:01, Lorenzo said, along with Marcus's documentation, along with the name of the sealed federal investigation and its connection to Harton's directorship. He paused. And the footage from camera 9. Claudette closed her eyes. For a moment, she just stood there with her eyes closed and the ring turning on her finger and the ambient silence of the room pressing in around her. Then she opened her eyes and she looked at Preston Hale and she said, Call Simmons. Preston looked at her. Call Simmons, she said again. Tell him to initiate the reserve exit, all of it. Something in Preston's posture, the last of it, the final architecture of the evening's performance, gave way. Not dramatically, it just went. He bent down, picked up the cracked phone from the floor, looked at the broken screen for a moment, and then turned and walked toward the corridor. Naomi watched him go. The room exhaled. Not all at once. In the same wave pattern as the silence had come in. First the people nearest to the center of things, then the next ring out, then the next. Conversations didn't resume. Nothing that had happened in the last 40 minutes allowed for the resumption of casual conversation, but the frozen quality broke and people moved and the air became breathable again in a different way. Naomi became aware, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, that she was still wearing Lorenzo's jacket. She was also aware that her legs were tired, deeply, structurally tired, the kind of tired that lives below the knee and has been building for hours and only presents itself when the adrenaline stops running. She put one hand back on the chair she'd grabbed earlier and didn't make it obvious. Lorenzo was watching her. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "You've been on your feet since 5:30 this morning." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "The event started at 7. Setup for an event this size starts 14 hours before. You strike me as the kind of person who gets there before her team does." It was accurate. She didn't confirm it. "I have work to finish," she said. "The seating transition happened 20 minutes ago," he said. "Your team handled it." She looked toward the main body of the ballroom and saw that he was right. The transition had happened. The tables were configured correctly. The first course was being served. The program was running on schedule. Her team had done what good teams do when the person running them is occupied with something else. They had handled it. She sat down. Not in a dramatic way. She just put herself in the chair because her legs needed it, and she was past the point of performing otherwise. She set her tablet on the table. She put her hands flat on the tablecloth and looked at them. "You need to explain something to me," she said. Lorenzo pulled the chair across from her and sat. "I know," he said. "You knew my name before tonight." "Yes." "You knew what I looked like." A pause. "Yes." "You knew I was going to be here." "I found out 3 days ago, when I was looking into the event's attendee and staff documentation." "Why were you looking into the event's documentation?" "Because of the Harton connection, because of the names on the guest list, because something about the arrangement felt wrong, and I wanted to understand it before I decided whether to intervene." "And when you found my name in the documentation," she said. She was looking at her hands, not avoiding him, just managing the information she was receiving in real time, the way she managed everything, by looking at it carefully before she spoke. "You recognized it." "Yes." "From where?" He was quiet for a moment, not the calculated quiet of a man managing a conversation. Something more like the quiet of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is working out how to put it down without dropping it. "There was a community center," he said, "on the south side, Meridian and Callaway. It was called the Callaway Street Center. It's not there anymore. The building was demolished in 2019 and they moved the programs to a facility 2 blocks north. But in 2009-2010, it was still there." Naomi's hands had gone still on the tablecloth. "I was 17, he said, "and I had been sleeping in the parking structure behind the Meridian Street Grocery for 11 days. And I came into the Callaway Street Center on a Thursday evening because it was raining and the door was open." The room around them had become something ambient, something that existed at a different distance than this conversation. "There was a woman running the volunteer dinner that night," he said. "She was young, early 20s, maybe. Natural hair, pulled back. She was doing 4 things at once, the way people do when they're running something with half the staff they need and twice the attendees they planned for. And I came in looking like what I was, a kid who hadn't eaten properly in 3 days and hadn't slept in a bed in longer than that. And everybody else in the room was busy, they had their systems, they had their workflow, and they didn't have space to accommodate something that didn't fit the system." Naomi's jaw had tightened. "She wasn't busy," Lorenzo said. "Or she was, but she stopped being busy when I walked in. She looked at me across the room and she came over and she didn't ask me what I needed because it was obvious what I needed. She just said, 'I need someone to help me carry a box to the back table. You want to give me a hand?'" The silence between them had changed. It was different from the ballroom's silence. This was the silence of 2 people in the same memory. "She gave me a task," Lorenzo said, "because she understood that I wasn't going to accept charity. Not at 17, not with whatever was in me then, but I would do work. And I carried the box. And by the time we got to the back table, there was a plate of food at a seat. And she said, 'Sit, you've earned it.' And I sat." Naomi was looking at him now. "She stayed," he said, "while I ate. She didn't make conversation. She didn't ask me questions about where I came from, or what had happened to me, or where my parents were. She just stayed. And when I was done, she gave me a clean shirt from the donation box, and she wrote the address of a shelter 2 blocks away on a piece of paper, and she handed it to me, and she said, "They have beds. They won't ask you anything tonight." He stopped. "And then she went back to running the dinner," he said, "because that was her job and she had 20 other people to look after, and she was doing it on 4 hours of sleep and the organizational equivalent of chewing gum and wire. And she never once—" He stopped again. "She never once made me feel like what she did was exceptional, like I should be grateful, like I owed her something. She just treated it like the obvious thing to do when a person is standing in front of you and needs something you can provide." Naomi's eyes had gone bright. She was not going to cry in the Grand Imperial Hotel's ballroom. She was not going to do that. But the brightness was there. "I looked for the Callaway Street Center 8 years later," Lorenzo said, "when I had the means to look for things. The records were incomplete. The center had closed and reopened under a different name, and the volunteer documentation from that period was mostly paper-based, and a significant portion of it had been lost. I found a partial volunteer roster from 2009. He looked at her directly. "Your name was on it." The brightness in Naomi's eyes was not leaving. "Naomi Carter," he said, "age 21, volunteer coordinator, Thursday evening dinner service." She put one hand over her mouth, a quick, involuntary gesture. She took it away again immediately. "I've spent 7 years," Lorenzo said, "trying to find the right version of this moment." "Lorenzo, I don't want anything from you," he said, and it came out fast, with an urgency that was different from everything else he'd said tonight. This is not a transaction. I'm not here because I feel like I owe a debt that needs to be settled. I'm here because when I found your name in this hotel's event documentation 3 days ago and understood what was being arranged around this event, I was not going to watch something happen to you because of arrangements you weren't party to and hadn't consented to. That's all." Naomi looked at him for a long time. The room existed. People moved in it. Plates were cleared, glasses were refilled. The charity dinners program moved through its scheduled segments with the improbable, self-sustaining momentum of events that had been well organized by someone who was currently sitting at a table near the East Corridor having one of the most significant conversations of her life, while that momentum carried everything forward without her. "That's not all," she said. He held her gaze. "There's more," she said. "You didn't come here just to protect me from the arrangements around this event. If that was it, you would have called someone, filed something. You didn't need to be here in person for any of that." He didn't answer. "You came here," she said, "because you needed to know if you'd remembered it right." Something shifted in his face. The precision of it, the absolute accuracy of what she'd just said, moved through him visibly. "Yes," he said, barely audible. "You needed to know if the woman you'd been carrying in your head for 15 years was real." "Yes." She looked down at her hands on the tablecloth. "And?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Worse," he said. She looked up. "She's worse than I remembered," he said. "The real version. The version I remembered could do 4 things at once and feed a 17-year-old kid without making him feel small. The real version does all of that and also manages a charity gala single-handedly while being publicly humiliated and doesn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing it land, and then sits in the middle of the most complicated evening of the last 6 months and figures out the shape of what's happening faster than people I pay to figure things out. And then—" He stopped. "And then she tells me the truth I didn't want to hear, which is that I didn't come here just to protect her. I came here because I needed to know." Naomi was very still. The brightness in her eyes had not gone away. From across the room, Carver appeared at Lorenzo's elbow. He waited 2 full seconds before speaking, which was longer than Carver typically waited for anything, and which communicated in Carver's specific vocabulary that he understood the nature of the conversation he was interrupting. "Simmons confirmed the reserve exit," Carver said. "Capital will be in the correct accounts by 7 a.m. tomorrow." Lorenzo nodded once without looking away from Naomi. "And Preston?" Lorenzo said. "In the lobby, on the phone with what sounds like his attorney." "Let him be." "Claudette Marsh left the building 3 minutes ago." "I know. The 4 names on the guest list, I'll deal with them separately, not tonight." "Understood." Carver stepped back. Naomi had been watching this exchange. Now she looked at Lorenzo. "It's not done," she said. "Tonight. The 4 names. Whatever Harton Advisory is actually connected to. It's not done. No, he said. And tomorrow morning, she said, the foundation presentation, the East Conference Room. There are going to be people in that room who expected the money not to be there, who structured their own plans around the gap. I know. That's going to be its own situation. Yes. And you're going to be involved in it. Yes. She looked at him. Are you going to tell me what that involvement looks like? She said. Or are you going to be as forthcoming about that as you've been about everything else tonight, which is accurate when pushed, but not exactly volunteering information? Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The same ghost of one as before. I'll tell you everything, he said. When? When you let me take you somewhere that isn't this ballroom and buy you an actual meal. You've been running on half a granola bar since 3 this afternoon. She stared at him. How do you know about the granola bar? She said. Camera 4, he said. Parking level 2. 14-17 hours. The ghost of a smile arrived on her face now, too. Small and involuntary and gone almost immediately. That's surveillance, she said. It's security footage from a hotel I have board-level access to. That's a very fine distinction. I make a lot of fine distinctions. She picked up her tablet from the table, looked at it, set it back down. She had 2 items left on her checklist, and both of them could be handled by her team in the next 20 minutes without her, and she knew it, and there was something strange and slightly disorienting about knowing it, about sitting in a room she'd been managing all evening and understanding that the management could release her and keep going without missing a step. She looked at Lorenzo. The jacket, she said. Keep it tonight. It costs less than the dinner I'm offering to buy you. She looked at him for a long moment. The room moved around them. The charity dinners program had reached its main address. Someone at a podium at the front of the ballroom was saying something with the particular cadence of prepared remarks that would be reported in tomorrow's society pages. And the chandeliers were doing what chandeliers at these events always do, throwing light across expensive fabrics and practiced smiles. And the complicated, layered, irreducible reality of human beings gathered in a room together, pretending toward their best selves, and falling short in the ways that people always fall short, and occasionally, surprising themselves. Naomi Carter picked up her tablet. She stood up. She looked across the room at table 7, the one with the chair she'd flagged on Tuesday, the wobble, and saw that someone on her team had replaced it without being asked, sometime in the last hour, quietly, because that was the kind of team she built, the kind that learned to see what she saw and act before she had to direct them. She looked back at Lorenzo. 1 meal, she said. 1 meal, he said, and you tell me everything. Everything I know, he said, which is more than you currently think it is and less than you're going to want it to be, which is how information usually works. She held his gaze. Outside the Grand Imperial Hotel, in the city that didn't care what happened inside its buildings, the night was running and the clocks were moving and 9 a.m. was coming, whether anyone in the East Conference Room was ready for it or not. And in a lobby 3 floors down, Preston Hale was on the phone with his attorney, speaking in the rapid, clipped sentences of a man outlining damages, outlining options, outlining the architecture of a response. And in those sentences, beneath the legal framing and the professional control, was the voice of a man who had spent his entire evening. Preston Hale had been talking to his attorney for 9 minutes when Lorenzo walked into the lobby. He didn't walk in fast, didn't walk in with Carver at his shoulder or any of the other signals that would have announced the arrival as something other than what it appeared. A man leaving a charity dinner early, crossing a hotel lobby, moving toward the exit. Preston saw him coming and his hand tightened around his phone and he said into it, "Hold on!" And then he lowered the phone to his side and stood his ground. The same way he'd stood his ground in the ballroom, with the same fundamental miscalculation about what standing his ground would accomplish. "My attorney is on the line," Preston said. "I know," Lorenzo said. "Whatever you're about to say to me." "I'm not going to say anything to you," Lorenzo said. He stopped 6 feet away. "I came down here to give you some information. What you do with it is your decision." Preston waited. "The sealed federal investigation I mentioned," Lorenzo said. "The one connected to Harton Advisory's directorship. It unseals in 11 days. Whatever your attorney is telling you right now about your options, he's telling you based on an 11-day window that he doesn't know exists. You should probably tell him." Preston's face didn't move. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Lorenzo looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not warmth and not coldness, but something in between. The expression of a man who has lived long enough to understand that the line between the person you become and the person you could have been is usually a series of very small decisions made in very ordinary moments, and who has stopped being surprised by which side of that line people end up on. Because Claudette Marsh already knows, Lorenzo said. She's had a contact inside the federal office for 3 months. She's known the unsealing date since April. She let you believe you had 60 days of cover. You have 11. He paused. She was not your partner in this arrangement. She was your ceiling. Preston Hale stood very still in the lobby of the Grand Imperial Hotel with his cracked phone in his hand and the weight of the evening settling into him in the way that certain kinds of understanding settle, not all at once, but in stages, each one heavier than the last. "You're telling me this," Preston said slowly, "because you want me to cooperate with whatever comes next." "I'm telling you this," Lorenzo said, "because in 11 days you're going to wish someone had told you tonight, and I'd rather not be the reason you didn't know." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a card, plain, white, a phone number handwritten in ink. "That number reaches Marcus. He can connect you with people who handle situations like yours with significantly more competence than whoever you currently have on retainer. Whether you call it is up to you." He set the card on the edge of the front desk. He turned and walked back toward the elevator. "DeLuca," Preston said. Lorenzo stopped. "The woman," Preston said. His voice had lost everything now. The authority, the performance, the weaponized quietness. What was left was just a voice, a tired one. "Naomi Carter, what I said tonight was, I know what it was," Lorenzo said, without turning around. "I need you to understand that it wasn't—" Preston stopped, started again. "I've said things like that before, in rooms like that one, and there were never consequences. You say something like that and the room laughs and you move on, and the person on the other end of it has no recourse. They just have to absorb it and keep working and—" He stopped again. "I'm not explaining myself. I'm not asking for—" He made a sound that was mostly just air. "I don't know what I'm doing." Lorenzo turned around. He looked at Preston Hale for a long moment. At this man who had spent his entire evening being the architect of other people's discomfort and who was now standing in a hotel lobby at 11:15 at night with a cracked phone and 11 days of cover he'd only just learned about. "The Meridian Street Transitional Housing Project," Lorenzo said, "the one whose capital you rerouted. Its director is a woman named Sandra Okafor. She has been running that facility for 9 years on a combination of municipal grants and private donations, and an absolute refusal to let it close even when every financial indicator suggested it should. The 53 people currently in residence there include 14 children." He paused. "When you're thinking about what you said to Naomi Carter tonight, you might also think about Sandra Okafor and the 14 children. And what it means when the people who are supposed to safeguard resources for people with nowhere else to go decide those resources are more useful somewhere else." He didn't wait for Preston to respond. He got in the elevator. The doors closed. Upstairs, in the ballroom, the charity dinners program was winding toward its conclusion with the particular gravity of events that have run longer than their scheduled time but are now achieving the emotional arc they were designed to achieve. The part of the evening where the speeches become less formal and more sincere, and the audience, loosened by food and drink, and the particular sentiment that expensive charity events are engineered to produce, begins to feel the specific temporary generosity that would translate into pledges tomorrow morning. Naomi was not watching this from the perimeter, which was where she had spent most of the evening. She was standing near the dessert station with a glass of water she'd finally allowed herself, watching her team manage the room's final hour with the particular satisfaction of a person who has built something that can run without her and is watching it run. Her earpiece was in. She wasn't using it, just a habit, a comfort, maybe. The young server, the one from Camera 9, the one who had turned her face away from the group around Preston Hale rather than participate, was clearing a table nearby. She was working with her head down, the specific posture of someone who is trying to be invisible, who has spent the last hour recalibrating whether this evening was going to have consequences for her employment. Naomi watched her for a moment. Then she walked over. "Hey," she said quietly. The server looked up. Her name tag said Daria. She was young up close, 22, maybe 23, with the particular exhausted quality of someone working a second job, the kind of tiredness that lives in the eyes before it makes it to the rest of the face. "You're the event coordinator," Daria said. The wariness was there, but so was something else, some recognition. "I am," Naomi said. "You did good work tonight." Daria blinked. "I just cleared tables." "You did more than that," Naomi said. "Near the bar station, earlier, when the group was—" She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to. She could see from Daria's face that the younger woman knew exactly which moment she meant. "You didn't participate." "I wasn't going to—" Daria started and then stopped, and something in her face moved through uncertainty into something more direct. It wasn't right, what they were saying. It wasn't— She glanced around, checking habit, the reflex of a woman who has learned to check who's listening before she says what she thinks. "It wasn't right." "No," Naomi said, "it wasn't." "I couldn't—" Daria's jaw tightened. "I couldn't say anything. I had the tray and there were guests and it wasn't my place to—" "I know," Naomi said. "I should have said something." "Maybe," Naomi said. "Or maybe you protected yourself, which is also something you're allowed to do." She looked at the younger woman for a moment. "You're working 2 jobs." Daria looked at her. "How did you know that?" "The way you hold your shoulders," Naomi said. "The specific kind of tired. I've been there." She reached into her jacket, Lorenzo's jacket, and found in the interior pocket what she'd been looking for, a business card. Her own. Standard design, contact information, the small logo of her consulting company. She held it out. "I have a project starting in February. Corporate event series, 3 months minimum, probably extends. I need people who are reliable and who don't participate in things that aren't right." She paused. "Send me your resume." Daria looked at the card, then at Naomi, then at the card again. "I don't have a formal—" she started. "Send me what you have," Naomi said. "We'll work with it." Daria took the card. She held it the way people hold things that are small and significant, carefully, with both hands, with the particular attention of someone who understands that small things can be the ones that change the direction. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for tonight," Naomi said. And she meant it in the specific way, the way that doesn't require elaboration, when both people in the conversation know exactly what is being referenced and what it cost. She walked back toward the east corridor. Lorenzo was waiting there. He had come back up from the lobby with the particular quietness that characterized everything he did, and he was standing near the corridor entrance with his hands in the pockets of his trousers, jacket still on Naomi's shoulders, and watching the room with the same comprehensive attention he'd arrived with, which had not relaxed since he walked through the ballroom doors 4 hours ago. "The server," he said, when Naomi reached him. "Camera 4 showed her on a break in the staff area at 7:30, Naomi said. "She looked like she was crying. I'd been meaning to check on her all evening." Lorenzo watched the young woman resume clearing tables across the room. "You gave her a job." "I gave her a card. She has to follow up." "She will," he said. "You don't know that." "I know the look of someone who just got thrown a line and knows it," he said. "I know it very well." Naomi looked at him. The evening was in her face now. Not the damage of it, the plain, honest weight of it, the kind that comes from having done significant things in a short amount of time and knowing that more significant things were waiting on the other side of morning. "The presentation tomorrow," she said. 9 a.m. I'm still contracted as the event coordinator. I'll be in the East Conference Room." "I know." "I'm going to need to know everything you know before I walk into that room," she said. "Not most of it. Everything." "Over dinner," he said. "We're getting dinner at 11:30 at night." "There's a diner on Crestwood and 9th that's open until 2, he said. "The kind of diner with fluorescent lights and coffee that's been on the burner since noon and booths with cracked vinyl. You'll hate the ambiance. The food is very good." She looked at him. "You know a lot of things about this city that don't match the 3 SUVs and the Italian jacket," she said. "I grew up here," he said simply, "in the parking structure behind the Meridian Street grocery. Among other places." She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not absence of thought, but the presence of too many thoughts being organized into an order that can be spoken. "I don't know what to do with you," she said finally. Not unkind, not a complaint, just honest. in the way she'd been honest all evening when the professional surface had been insufficient to contain what was actually happening. "I'm not asking you to do anything with me," he said. "I'm asking you to eat a meal and let me tell you the truth about tomorrow and what comes after. After that, every decision is yours." "Every decision has always been mine," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's how I want it." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she reached up and pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders. Not because she was cold, the hotel was climate controlled to within a precise degree, but because it was there and it was something real in a night that had been constructed entirely of unrealities, and sometimes the body knows what it needs before the mind has the language for it. "Crestwood and Ninth," she said. 10 minutes by car. "I need to sign off with my team first." "I know," he said. She walked back into the ballroom one more time. The radio call was brief. 2 minutes, maybe 3. The final sign-off of an event coordinator releasing her team to handle the breakdown and cleanup, the standard end-of-night communication that she had delivered at the conclusion of more events than she could count. Her voice was level, professional. She thanked them by name, each one, which she always did, and which some of them had told her in previous working relationships was the reason they kept signing on for her projects. Not the rate, though the rate was fair, but the fact that she said their names at the end of long nights when most clients were already in cars headed home. She pulled the earpiece out and coiled the wire and put both in her bag. She picked up her tablet. She stood in the middle of the Grand Imperial Hotel's ballroom at 11:37, on a night that had started as a seating chart problem and a wobbling chair and a checklist with 17 items, and had become something she did not yet have a complete vocabulary for, and she looked at the room. It was changed. Not physically. The chandeliers still threw the same light across the same expensive surfaces. The remaining guests still wore the same expensive fabrics. The charity dinners program had concluded, and the room was now in the social decompression phase that always followed these events, people finding their coats and their drivers and their versions of what the evening had been. But the room was changed in the way rooms are changed by things that happen in them. Not visibly, not in any way that could be documented or proven, but changed in the permanent, irreversible way that makes the air of a place different after something real has occurred in it. Claudette Marsh was not in the room, had not been since she left 3 minutes after agreeing to initiate the reserve exit. Her departure had been noted by people and filed under various categories: early night, family obligation, the particular social calculus of people who understand that a room's energy has shifted and choose to exit before the shift fully registers. 2 of the 4 names Carver had mentioned were still present. Naomi could see them from where she stood, one near the bar, one near the coat check, both of them occupying the specific kind of space that people occupy when they are in a room, under conditions they cannot fully control, and are managing the discomfort of that by keeping their bodies very still and their expressions very managed. They didn't look at each other, didn't look toward the east corridor where Lorenzo stood. Looked, with the practiced achievement of people who had spent long careers in rooms like this one, as though everything was fine, as though the evening had been pleasant, as though the specific texture of the last 4 hours was nothing more than the normal friction of a long social event. Naomi looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at table 7. The chair she'd flagged on Tuesday, the one with the wobble, the one her team had replaced sometime during the evening without being asked, was gone, replaced cleanly, no mark of its absence except the fact of the new chair sitting in its place with the solidity of something that had always been there. She turned and walked toward the east corridor. The next hour and 40 minutes happened at a booth in a diner on Crestwood and Ninth, under fluorescent lights that were exactly as unforgiving as Lorenzo had implied, over coffee that had indeed been on the burner since something approximating noon, and over food that was exactly as good as he'd said. The kind of good that has nothing to do with presentation and everything to do with someone in a kitchen who knows what they're doing and has been doing it long enough to stop thinking about it. Lorenzo talked. He said everything, not in the performed way of a man managing a confession, but in the plain, sequential way of a man delivering accurate information to someone who needs it to make sound decisions. The federal investigation and its unsealing date. The 4 names and what they represented, and what their involvement with Harton Advisory suggested about the arrangements that had been made around the Foundation's capital. What Marcus had found, and how, and what the documentation was likely to produce when it became relevant, which it would, and soon, He talked about the foundation itself, about the history of it, who had established it, and with what stated intent, and where the stated intent had diverged from the actual operation, and when that divergence had become something that warranted the kind of attention it was now receiving. And then, because Naomi had said everything, he talked about things that were not about tomorrow morning. He talked about the years between the Callaway Street Center and tonight. Not all of them, and not in detail. There were things that would not be said in a diner at midnight, things that belonged to a different conversation at a different distance than 11 hours of knowing each other could provide. But enough. The shape of it. The particular series of choices that had led a hungry 17-year-old from a parking structure to where he was now, and the specific ways in which those choices had not been clean, and the specific price of the things that hadn't been clean, and the fact that he had stopped pretending otherwise in any direction. Naomi listened. She did what she always did when she was receiving information she needed to process carefully. She kept her face neutral and her hands still, and she listened to the full thing before she responded to any part of it, which most people found unnerving because they mistook the stillness for absence when what it actually was the most complete form of presence she knew how to offer. When he was done, she sat with it for a moment. The foundation, she said, the original intent, before it got layered over. Youth housing, he said, job training, emergency support for people who fall through the gaps in the city's existing systems. Those are the programs that were going to receive the capital. Yes. And when the capital goes back tomorrow morning, she said, when Simmons executes the reserve exit and the money arrives in the correct accounts before 9 a.m. The programs receive it. Sandra Okafor receives it. The Meridian Street facility gets through the end of the year. Yes. And the 4 names on the guest list, she said, the ones who arrange their own plans around the gap in the capital. What happens to them when the unsealing happens in 11 days? Federal question, he said, not mine to manage. My involvement is in the documentation that supports the investigation, not the investigation itself. You've been building that documentation, she said. Marcus has been building that documentation. Since when? He was quiet for a moment. 7 months. She looked at him. This wasn't about tonight. Tonight was a... He paused. Tonight was a convergence. The event gave me the opportunity to address several things at once. It was not the plan I would have chosen. But I was here. Yes. And that changed things. Yes, he said. It changed what I was willing to let happen inside that building tonight, and it changed the speed at which I addressed it, and it changed... He stopped, put his coffee cup down, looked at it. It changed things. She absorbed this. Outside the diner's windows, Crestwood Avenue was doing what the city's streets do at this hour. Not sleeping exactly, but running on a different current, the specific low-frequency hum of a city that never fully powers down, just shifts registers. A delivery truck. A couple walking with the particular gait of people who have nowhere they urgently need to be. The traffic lights cycling through their sequence for the benefit of a street that was mostly empty. I want to ask you something, Naomi said. Ask, he said. The Callaway Street Center, she said. Thursday evening, November 2009. She looked at her coffee. I don't remember you. She said it plainly, without apology, because it was the truth, and she was a person who said the truth plainly. I know, he said. I need you to understand what I mean by that, she said. I'm not saying I remember the evening, and not you specifically. I'm saying that there were a lot of Thursday evenings. There were a lot of people who came through that door. Some of them I remember, the ones who came back multiple times, the ones who had specific situations that required ongoing coordination, the ones who... She stopped. I don't remember you, and I need you to know that I understand what that might mean for everything you just told me. That the thing you've been carrying for 15 years is something I don't have the corresponding memory for. And I don't want you to... She stopped again, looked for the right word. I don't want you to have built something on a foundation that exists only on one side. Lorenzo looked at her for a long time. That's exactly what you would say, he said. I'm serious. I know you are, he said. That's what I mean. He leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, present. I didn't come to you tonight expecting you to remember me. I didn't expect to find something mutual. I came because what I carried wasn't a story about 2 people. It was a story about one person doing something that mattered when it didn't have to. That's a complete thing on its own. It doesn't require you to have kept a record of it. She looked at him. But you looked for me for 7 years, she said. Yes. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not nothing. So what is it? He was quiet for a moment. It's me not being able to let the most important thing that ever happened to me stay anonymous forever. The diner's ambient noise continued around them. The specific sounds of a late-night diner, a short-order cook's radio somewhere in the back, playing something low and indistinct, the hiss of the coffee machine resetting, a bell over the door as someone came in from the cold and brought a brief gust of night air with them. Naomi looked at her hands on the table. I gave a lot of people food and clean shirts in those years, she said, at the Callaway Center and other places. I don't say that to diminish what happened to you. I say it because I need you to understand who I am, the same way you told me who you are. I'm a person who has been doing that work for a long time, and it wasn't about any individual outcome. It was about the work itself. And most of the time, I didn't get to know what happened to people afterward. They came through the door, and I helped where I could, and they went back out into whatever they were going back out into, and I went home and slept 4 hours and came back on Thursday and did it again. That was the job. That was what I chose. I know, he said. And I'm not saying this to make tonight smaller, she said. Tonight was not small. She looked up. Tonight was one of the least small evenings of my life, and I've had some evenings that qualified. But I need you to understand that the woman you built in your head for 15 years, the one who did the obvious thing because it was the obvious thing, she didn't know she was doing anything significant. She was just trying to get everyone fed and the chairs folded and be out by 9. Something happened in Lorenzo's face, something real and unhurried and unmanaged. That's why, he said. That's exactly why, Naomi. That's the whole point. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. You didn't know. You were not. There was no performance in it. There was no calculation. You were running on 4 hours of sleep and a half-staffed kitchen and 20 people who needed things, and a kid walked in who needed something, and you just... He stopped. You just did it. You didn't decide whether he deserved it. You didn't assess whether he was going to be worth the investment. You just gave him a task and a meal and a clean shirt and an address, and you went back to work. He set the cup down. I had met a lot of people by the time I walked into that center. People who helped for reasons. People who helped because they needed to feel like helpers. People who helped because they needed the person they were helping to see them helping. You were the only one who helped because someone needed help, and you happened to be there. The words sat in the air between them. Naomi was quiet for a long time. That's a lot to put on a Thursday evening, she said finally. Yes, he said. I know. She breathed. And what happens now? After tonight? After tomorrow morning? The documentation Marcus has built goes to the federal office, he said, in conjunction with the unsealing. The investigation moves forward without my active participation. The people at the foundation who were involved in the capital redirection face the legal consequences of that involvement. The capital is in the correct accounts and the programs that needed it have it. And Preston Hale, she said. He has 11 days and a phone number, Lorenzo said. What he does with those is his. And Claudette Marsh. She has a federal contact she trusted and 3 months of lead time, he said. She used them to protect herself and not the people she was in arrangement with. That's a kind of answer about who she is. The legal system will ask its own questions. And the Naomi Carter Foundation, Naomi said. Lorenzo was still. The name sat there, announced. That was going to be part of what I told you tonight, he said carefully. I found the paperwork on the tablet, she said. Frederick Goss's desk. When I was doing the final sign-off with my team, the foundation's name change documentation. It was in the stack of materials for tomorrow's presentation. It had been filed 3 weeks ago. She looked at him. The same week I was hired. Yes, he said. You put my name on a foundation, she said. I registered the name, he said. Whether it gets used is your decision. You can't... She stopped. Started again. Lorenzo, you cannot put my name on a charitable foundation without asking me. You're right, he said. I should have asked first. That was a mistake. The directness of it, no qualification, no justification, disarmed her in the specific way that direct accountability disarms people who are prepared to argue and suddenly have nothing to argue against. She looked at him. "Why my name?" she said. "Because it's yours," he said. "Because the work the foundation is supposed to do is the same work you've been doing in various forms since you were 21 years old. And the city is full of charitable foundations named after people who wrote checks. And you are not a person who wrote checks, and you deserve to have your name on something that is real." The brightness was back in her eyes. She was not going to cry in a diner on Crestwood and 9th at 12:47 in the morning over fluorescent lights and burnt coffee. She was not going to do that. "You need to ask me," she said. "I'm asking you," he said, "right now, tonight, with full acknowledgement that I went about the sequence wrong and should have started here." She looked at him for a long time, at the face that had moved through the evening carrying everything it was carrying, the 15 years, the documentation, the specific weight of a man who had walked into a building tonight knowing that before he left, certain things were going to break open, and had walked in anyway. "The board," she said. "If I agree. The foundation's board structure." "You chair it," he said. "Full authority over programmatic decisions. I provide capital and legal infrastructure, and I don't sit on the board." "Why not?" "Because the work should be yours," he said. "My name in that room would change what the room is, change who comes to it and what they say when they're in it and what they're willing to risk for it. Your name creates a different room." She thought about this, about Sandra Okafor and the Meridian Street facility and the 14 children and the 9 years of refusing to let something close that needed to stay open, about Daria and the business card and the resume that would arrive in 2 weeks, maybe 3, tentatively formatted, a little rough, absolutely worth reading, about the Callaway Street Center and the Thursday evenings, and all the people who had come through that door over the years and gone back out into whatever they were going back out into, about what it meant to do the obvious thing without knowing it was significant. "The programmatic focus," she said, "youth housing, job training, emergency support," he said, "what was always supposed to be there." "I want to add something," she said. "Tell me." "Transitional employment support for women re-entering the workforce after extended caregiving," she said. "It's a population that falls through every existing gap. I've been watching it for years, and there's nothing specifically structured for them in this city." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Just yes?" "Just yes," he said. "It's your foundation. If you agree to it being your foundation." She was quiet. The coffee machine reset again, somewhere behind the counter. The cook's radio shifted to something that might have been from 20 years ago, something with a piano and a voice that had lived enough to earn the notes it was using. "Ask me properly," she said. Lorenzo put both hands flat on the table. He looked at her across the booth with the fluorescent light doing what fluorescent light does, stripping everything back, removing the shimmer of occasion, leaving just the actual faces of actual people in an actual room. "Naomi," he said, "I would like to put your name on something that does real work in the world. Work that matches who you are and what you've been doing for 15 years without recognition. I'm asking your permission to do that, and your participation in building what it becomes, on your terms and in your direction. And I'm asking you to let me be the person who makes sure it has the resources it needs without being the person who defines what it is." She looked at him. "You're going to be a complicated presence in my life," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need that to be something I choose," she said, "not something that happens to me." "I know," he said. "I'm choosing it," she said. "Carefully and with full awareness that you have a way of arranging things in advance, and a security chief named Carver and a man named Marcus who can pull financial documentation from locations I probably don't want to know about. I'm choosing it with all of that accounted for." "Understood," he said. She picked up her coffee. It was genuinely bad. She drank it anyway. "The presentation tomorrow," she said. 9 a.m. 9 a.m., he said. "I'll be in the East Conference Room," she said, "doing my job." "I know," he said. "And you'll be—" "Where I need to be," he said, "which is probably not in the East Conference Room. The presentation goes better without me in the room." "Most things go better without you in the room," she said. "Until they don't." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. The ghost of the smile that had been appearing and disappearing all evening, and this time it stayed a little longer before it went. They sat in the diner on Crestwood and Ninth until the coffee ran out, and the cook's radio went quiet, and the night on the other side of the windows shifted toward the particular pale quality that precedes morning. Not light yet, just the absence of the deepest dark, the city resetting itself for another day of being what it was. Naomi put Lorenzo's jacket on properly before they went outside. Properly meaning both arms through the sleeves, collar up against the hour's cold, the interior pocket still containing the business card she'd given to Daria. She did not comment on doing this. He did not comment on noticing. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the diner. The city breathed around them. 7 a.m., she said. Confirmation that the capital is in the correct accounts. I'll have Carver send it, he said. Send it to me directly, she said. Not through Carver. He looked at her. You have my number, she said. You've had it for 3 weeks since you found me in the hotel's event documentation. Use it. He held her gaze for a moment. 7 a.m., he said. She nodded. Started toward the car her team had left for her at the end of the night, a standard contractor arrangement. The driver already texted and waiting half a block up. She stopped. She turned back. Lorenzo, she said. He was still standing outside the diner, still watching her with the same comprehensive attention she'd been inside all evening. The Thursday dinner, she said. November 2009. I don't remember you. She paused. But I remember a coat. A winter coat, dark blue, men's, too large for the person wearing it. It was on the donation rack for 3 weeks before someone took it on a Thursday. I remember thinking, whoever took that coat needed it. I hope it fit. She paused again. Did it fit? Lorenzo was very still. Not exactly, he said, but it was warm. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned and walked toward the waiting car, and the night held its shape around her. The quiet street, the pale pre-dawn, the city doing what it always did, turning itself over and beginning again. And she walked through it with her hands in the pockets of a jacket that had cost more than most of her checks, and that she had not asked for and would figure out what to do with in the morning, along with everything else that the morning was going to require. Behind her, Lorenzo stood on the sidewalk outside a diner with fluorescent lights and watched her go. He had spent 15 years building toward a moment he couldn't fully anticipate. The moment had not been what he'd imagined. It had been more specific, more ordinary, more real. She hadn't remembered him. She had remembered a coat. He looked at the street, at the city breathing around him in the hour before it woke, at the space where she'd been standing before she walked away. Some things you spend years carrying and they never get lighter. They just become part of the way you move, part of the architecture of how you take up space in the world, and you stop being able to tell the difference between the weight and yourself. And then, sometimes, you put them down. And the absence of the weight is its own kind of answer. Carver appeared at his elbow. Car's ready, Carver said. Give me a minute, Lorenzo said. Carver stepped back. Lorenzo stood on the sidewalk outside the diner on Crestwood and Ninth, in a city he had grown up in and left and come back to and could not seem to fully leave. And he stood there for exactly 1 minute, which was the minute he'd asked for, and then he turned and walked to the car. Tomorrow was 9 a.m. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And for the first time in 15 years, that fact felt less like a sentence and more like something he had chosen. And the difference between those two things was enormous, and it had a name. And the name was on a foundation that was going to do real work in the world for a very long time. He got in the car. The city moved around it. The night gave way.